Hi. It's 2:40, so I guess I'll get started. And if people trickle in, that's fine. Don't worry about it. OK, so my name is Divya Sasidharan. I am a developer advocate at Netlify. And you can find me online everywhere at shortdiv. And just so you guys know, Netlify got a bunch of money recently. And so we're hiring for many different roles, like platform engineers. We recently hired front-end developers. So if you're interested in working for us, please reach out to me. And I'm more than happy to direct you in the right way. And I will also turn off my do not disturb on my phone. Yes. OK, so this is a talk that was inspired by my journey from moving from React to Vue. Just curious, how many people are Vue developers here? A couple? Awesome. How many people are React developers? More, obviously. OK, cool. Awesome. So I gave this talk at VueConf in March. And since then, a lot has changed. For one, React 16 came out in April. So that introduced a lot of changes to the API. Also, Vue has officially surpassed React in GitHub stars, which is cool. But it's zero indication of anything. It doesn't tell you anything about the frameworks, except for the fact that a lot of Vue developers actually come from a React background. And so this talk is inspired by that. And hopefully, it gives you, if you're a React developer, some understanding into how to do things that you would normally do in Vue. And so I've structured this talk with React people in mind. And Vue people, obviously, you can catch on because a lot of the concepts are in Vue. So we'll talk about componentization first. Then we'll move on to adding state to your components. We'll transition to talking about how to render children from parent components. And then lastly, we'll talk about a really popular concept, which is render props. And so we'll start with components, because components is a central concept in front-end development. When we build applications, we don't build in terms of a giant page. We build in terms of a system of components. Stephen Hay has a really great quote on this, where he talks about how we as developers and designers aren't actually creating giant pages and applications. We're designing systems of components. And we're figuring out how they all work together to build a larger application. And so in the spirit of that, I like to use analogies when I give my talks. And so I'm going to use a cup of tea to explain componentization. And this will be an analogy that goes throughout the talk. I also like to contextualize my talks to the location that I'm in. And because we're in Vancouver, I'm going to specifically talk about the London fog, which is actually called a Vancouver fog because it was created in Vancouver. Fun fact. It's not a necessary fact for this talk, but nonetheless. And so Vancouver fog is a tea latte. It consists of tea. It has a vanilla syrup to sweeten it. And then it has a milk foam on top because it is a latte. And then contained within it is a mug. It goes without saying, you need a container for your drink. So there is the mug component. And so if I represent this in components, you have a parent mug component. And then you have a bunch of children components. So tea being one, vanilla, and milk being the others, simplistically. And just to start off, we'll represent that component, the mug component, in React. And React 16, the first thing that is introduced is functions instead of classes. And so we're going to use functions for this. And the other reason is because this is purely presentational. So we have a function. We call it mug. Then we return a single div. We give it an ID. You can give it whatever ID you want. And then we return a couple of children components. And these, you can just assume, are single divs with IDs as well. And in Vue, you start to see the difference. Because in React, everything is imperative. You do everything in JavaScript and in JSX. And in Vue, there is a separation between your logic and your markup. So your template is where you specify the specific markup that you want your component to have. So I want it to have a div with an ID of mug. And then I want it to return my children components. And then in the script tag is where you specify all of the logic that you want that component to have. And in the spirit of parity, because we want our Vue code to look similar to our React code and vice versa, we're going to make this a functional component. And to do that, you just add the word functional to Vue, which is really sweet. And so the example I gave was very simplistic. Most of our applications actually have state in them or some kind of state. or props that get passed through. And so it's the same with T, because with T, you can have it hot or you can have it iced. There is always that option. So we'll use that moving forward. So we'll create a different component called hot, which represents steam of some form to show that it is a hot beverage. And then we will have a cold component, which you can use ice. I used snowflakes because it was easier to style. And so that represents the two different things. And if you wanted to show conditional logic in React, you could do that. You take in some props. In this case, it's like an isIced prop, which is a Boolean. And then you use a ternary function to return like a cold or hot element, depending on what that is. And in Vue, you can do the same thing, because Vue also allows for props to get passed through. So we have the idea of an isIced prop. We give it the type, so the type is a Boolean. And then in Vue, there's the idea of directives. So you use a vif, velse, so that it knows exactly what piece to render based on what that thing is. And another way of representing props in Vue is through an array. So you don't necessarily have to give it the type. It is always nice to give it the type, because it's easier to read, but you don't have to. And so here's a really quick demo. Oh man, I hope it works. Cool. And so I'm opening the Vue developer console, which is really sweet. It's similar to the React console because it allows you to see different components. So what I've created is I've created a single mug, which is the thing I showed you. And then it has all of these individual elements within them that represent the component. So it's really nice when you're developing applications because you know exactly how your application, what is in your application. Yes. And as I said, a lot of applications are not purely without state. There is some state. We passed in props, so there's an assumption that that prop was passed in from another component somewhere. So let's try to absorb that logic in some sense. So there's this.props that gets taken through, but we want to change it to state because that's how most of our applications work. So we're going to absorb that logic within it. So what we'll do is we'll create some kind of radio button. So when you click hot, it gives you a hot drink. If you click cold, it gives you a cold drink. And so we want to focus on this piece because that's the piece that allows you to drive the logic and what exactly gets rendered to the screen. And so for that, what we'll do is we'll create like some kind of options thing. And options is basically just input elements, which just translates to radio buttons in this case. And just a refresher for what radio buttons look like. They just look like this. There's an input, you give it the type, which is radio, and then you give it a name because you're grouping them. So in this particular instance, they are managing temperature, so we give it the name of temperature. You pass in a value, you pass in a checked element, and then there's some kind of on change. And there's other things you can do, like disabled and so on, but we're going to focus on these pieces. And so if we wanted to add that to React, we could. We just add that to our JSX. Except because now it's our stateful component, we're going to use a class because if you use a function that's purely a functional stateless component, and because our app now has state, we're going to change it to a class. And so we give it that label with the input, and then we can pass in a value. But before we do that, we have two radio buttons. So we're going to use an iterator, which you can use doing a map. So if we have a state, which is an array, then we have access to a map element, which allows you to map over things. So it gives you two radio buttons, which is really nice. And then you can pass that in. So now it has that value, and then you can do some kind of checked. So current temperature is like automatically by default, it is hot. And then the checked basically checks to see whether that value matches the actual like current temperature of the thing. And then the on change is where React you start to see the difference because there's this idea of set state. And that's how React handles state. Because anytime you want to change state, you have to use set state. You can't just automatically change that data property implicitly. And so what you do is you have this update temperature method that calls set state, so it updates the state appropriately based on whatever button you click on. And so, and then with that, now you have access to that state, and then you can render like the cold or the hot element, depending on what the current state is, which is cool. And in Vue, it looks a bit different. Again, like from a markup perspective, it's fairly similar because you're still adding that label, you're still adding that input. But whenever you do that iterator, it's different because like what we did with the vif, velse, we're adding a directive, which in this case is a v-for. So it's basically a for loop. And you're iterating through this idea of a temps, which is an array of like hot and cold. So it iterates through it and gives you 2 radio buttons. And then you can pass that through to the value. And then you have this idea of a checked element. So the current temp or the default is hot. And so the radio button basically checks to see whether its value is the same as the default. And then the on change, here it's like very different from the way that React handles state. Because in React, you have to call setState, and you can't implicitly change the data property from the component itself or from the render. But in Vue, you can do that, which is cool, because you can just like automatically just pass in and change that current temp based on whatever button gets clicked. And so this is where the reactivity system of Vue lies. It's the checked and the @change piece. And then again, like with that, you can use it to do your conditional logic with your cold and your hot components. It's pretty nice because in Vue, you don't have to write this much code. So checked and @change can actually be consolidated to what we call a V model. And a V model just adds reactivity to the specific component. So anytime you click on the thing, current temperature changes, and the component checks to see whether or not it is cold or hot. And so that's like by default reactivity in Vue. And so that's like a huge difference between the way that React and Vue work. So yay, reactivity. And so here's like a really quick demo of that. This demo looks a bit different from the one I just showed you, but the idea is the same, where if you click on a specific type of tea, you get the name of that tea. So if you click on like Rooibos, you get Cape Town fog. And Earl Grey, you get London fog. So I also denoted it by colors. So the green is Vue, and then the blue is React. And I'll like put links in the slides so you can play around with that, because there are very different ways in terms of how the reactivity works. But it's a really cool way of just like explaining the difference between the two. And so this is like a really nice segue into rendering children, because for example, when we have all of these elements within them, we have to be explicit. So we have our mug component, and we have to be explicit about all of these components being within it. But the thing is, so far the code that we've created doesn't actually look like this, and it doesn't work like this, because our mug is just a div, which has all those components within it. So if we were to use mug, you would actually just use it like this, which is fine, except mug is a container, and it doesn't make sense for a container to determine the beverage that it contains, because a mug is a container that is agnostic. And so ultimately, like if we were to reuse mug each time, it'll give you the same drink, which is fine if you like the same drink every time, but I assume you do not. And so sometimes you might want something cold. Sometimes you might want to change like the sweetener of something. So like a London or Vancouver fog uses vanilla, and something else might use like hazelnut or whatever sweetener exists in the world. And then you might want to change the type of tea. So like if you want an Earl Grey one versus a matcha one, because Earl Grey is like the default Vancouver fog, and then matcha I think is like Tokyo fog or something very generic. And so with mug, what you could do is, in order to make those changes to the type of the tea or the type of the sweetener or whatever, what we can do is we can pass in props. We talked about that, where you can basically pass in props of state. So you can check and then conditionally render things based on what that is. So is iced, whether there is a type of tea, whether there's a milk type, you can do it, all of these things. Where the problem lies with this specific thing is that if you wanted to change the order of your components, so if you're someone who prefers to put milk on the bottom of your teacup and then add tea like a heathen, then you cannot do that with the mug component that we've created, because the mug component already determines the logic of how things are rendered. And so what we want to move towards is a mug that doesn't know what its contents are, but just renders them regardless. And so with that, in React, we just pretty much pull away all of those contents, and then we can access children through this.props, because that's how you access children. And if you are someone who is familiar, that's just sugar syntax, so the JSX is sugar syntax for React.createElement. And React.createElement takes in 3 arguments. It takes in the element, so it's a div. It takes in some styles, like the ID or the class. and then it takes in children as its last argument. So this.props.children is the last argument. And in Vue, actually, you have access to the render method. So you can use render and write things with like really cool like render things. And so it takes in the same idea. It's not React.createElement, but it is a create element of some form. And it actually takes the same 3 arguments, which is really handy. So if you're a React person who wants to write Vue but doesn't like declarative syntax, you can use the render method. Feel free. But the problem is that children are not accessed through props because, like, obviously the implementation of Vue is not the same. They are different languages or frameworks. And so you access children through $options, _render_children, and that is a great way to do it, except if the underscore is any indication, that's probably not the best way to do it. You could access it through this $slots.default, which is just like the idea of the way Vue handles children is it's like, oh, here's a slot, and I assume that everything is my child. And so that's how you would render it, and everything is all fine and good. And if you're a hardcore React person who really loves JSX hardcore, you could write JSX in your Vue too, which I've done, so I would recommend it if that's what you like and enjoy doing. You just have to use like a Babel JSX plugin, which allows you to do that, and then it renders things for you. So you can pretty much write the same thing you would do in React, in Vue, and everything works, which is cool. And so I need to show you this. So one way of doing that is I'm going to jump into, can everybody see this code? Kind of. Oh, OK. So we have a div, and then we have all of these elements that we talked about previously. But what we want to do is we could just like refactor it so that we have this idea of a slot in our mug. And then I need to go to app and change this. So now we have like our mug element, which basically has a bunch of children in it. I hope that worked. Yes, it worked. And so it's nothing much has changed from like the rendering perspective, because you still have the mug and you still have all of the components, except you're doing the implementation a bit differently this time, which is pretty cool. But again, like in Vue, we're not imperative. We're pretty declarative in the way that you write things. You could write it this way. There's nothing wrong with it. But it's not really a Vue way of doing things. And so what you could do is you could just write in the template like slot, and then that tells Vue to render its slot. But a really key thing to note is that slot can't be a root element. So it always has to be wrapped within a component. So you need like that div in order for slot to work. And the nice thing about slot is you can also determine the order of the components that you want them in. So if you want T to always be on the bottom, you can name it. So you have 3 slots. T is on the bottommost component. And so anytime someone renders it differently, so if you were like slot equals milk or whatever, this will always render on the top. And T will always render on the bottom because you determined that before. And so, yeah, so render props is actually a really popular concept in React. And I think one of the things, the biggest questions I get when I talk to people who are like, why should I use Vue? Because they like render props. And so with that, I'm going to use like a bunch of documentation from the way that React explains it, because render props isn't really a Vue thing. And so a render prop, if you're unfamiliar, is a function that a component uses to know what to render. It's literally taking in a function as a prop. That's all you need to know, really. And so if we have our mug component, like all of the logic is within mug. So we created mug, and then we created all of the radio buttons. Like everything is contained within mug. Except sometimes we might want to change the container. Like we might want our thing to go. And we could do that. We could just change like the mug to a to-go element, which is fine. But the problem is that all of the logic is still within the container. And so what we want to do is we want to pull away that logic and give it, kind of pass it down so another component handles that logic for it. And the container just does whatever rendering things it needs to do. So what we'll do is we'll create like a component that is, I keep wanting to say higher order component, but that's a different thing in React. It's just a component that's like a parent of the parent, and we're going to call it order. And then we're going to implement this just to show you what render props look like in React. So we create this class called order, and then in the render method, we render the children. So remember how children are accessible through props? So we grab that children, and now we can run children as a function. So we can call child, or call children, and then you pass in like any context or state you want children to have access to. So because our order handles the temperature of our beverage, we can give it current temp, and then we have update temp, and then we can pass that down to children. So anytime the children need access to that, it just grabs it from the parent. So if we were to use that, we have like our Vancouver fog, which is our beverage, and then we use our order component. And then we can grab all of that context that we passed through. Context is, again, a bad word because that means something different, but you get the idea. It's like the scope elements. Scope also means something else, but whatever. And so you grab those things, and then you can pass it to your other children elements. So we have current temp. We can pass that to like the cold or the hot element. And then we have the temp options, which is like the radio buttons. So the radio buttons now don't determine their own logic, because it's just grabbing logic from the parent component, which is cool. In Vue, that's not how we write things, but we're going to try to get parity as much as possible, because like we're React developers who want to write Vue, so we're going to try. And so I'm going to call it render as a prop, because it's not really, like, render props is not well named. And so we have this idea of an order component, the same thing. And then we'll use render functions, because again, we want parity. And so what we'll do is we'll take in a props, like we'll call it RenderChild. And so RenderChild is a prop, and RenderChild is a type of function. And so now we can call that RenderChild, and we can pass it any like state that it needs to have access to. So we can pass it that current temperature, and we can pass it the update temp, which is a method. And then in order to use that, we create a Vancouver fog drink thing, and then we use our order, and then remember how order needs that prop, it needs that RenderChild prop. So you pass it the RenderChild prop, and then you can, to the RenderChild prop, you pass in the current temp or the update temp, basically things that you want your children to have access to. You don't actually need to have everything, but in this case, I'm using both. So I can grab those things, and I can pass them on to children components, and everything works as expected, which is really cool. And then that's one way of doing it, where you're literally using render props as render props. But that's not, again, how Vue works. And so scope slots is kind of similar, but different, but more Vue-like. And scope slots is the idea of how you have your order component. And in terms of rendering, all your rendering is this like scope slots. So what we talked about previously is like the slot component, where the parent is like, just render everything, I don't care. And so this is basically that, but we're using a render function. So like try to connect those two. And so you can access the slots, this.$scope slots.default, which is a function. And then you can pass in any scope elements that you want it to have access to. So current temp and update temp. And then in order to use it, you just grab that scope slots, and then you pass it the default with any like children elements, and then you return all of the children elements, and then you can pass in the arguments that it needs access to, which is cool. I think I have a demo. Oh, no. So I created 2 examples. There's one that's written in React. I think that's this one. Yes. So just the idea of like, so I called it a bit different things, but it's the same idea. So hot beverage is like the order thing, and then it has, voila. Okay, yeah, it has these specific things. So you're grabbing like the update temp and the current temp, and then you're passing it down to the children element. And so like here, it's grabbing it as a prop, and then you can pass in that onChange event to the child. And so anytime you update, it will update. It's very small. Never mind. It should work. Assume it works. I think the styling is a bit weird, but it's fine. And so that's all I have. This is like high-level concepts, and so like, I went through a lot of material, so if you have questions, like, feel free to ask. And here are some links. Please go around and play with it if you'd like, because a lot of the code I talked about is like fairly dense. And so if you play around with the demos, it gives you a better sense of like what exactly I just went through. That's all.